Okay, good afternoon. Hope everyone's doing okay. Had a great weekend. I'm going to start on a class session today on this particular board just for a few minutes, just so I can cover some material. I've got really too much to do on this middle board, so I'll swivel the camera back here in a minute. And usually I start out the class session by giving a bit of a brief update as to the calendar, like where we are now, where we're going to be going. Our only bit of activity for today is I've just got a little bit more to cover with regards to some of the content from chapter 3. What I'm not going to be able to get to, and I had sort of hoped I would last week, was the discussion on price floors and price ceilings. And even though I know it's in the module, I put it in Brightspace for last week, thinking that we would get to it prior to the exam. It doesn't look like we're going to get there. But I will talk about consumer and producer surplus, and I'll talk a little bit more about the equilibrium condition and what that looks like, and then we'll get into consumer and producer surplus. And then what I'd like to do is sort of leave myself around the top of the hour, I think, about 40, 45 minutes, something like that, in order to talk about the exam on Wednesday and what that's going to be about, what to expect, and how you can take it and all that. So, okay. So I'm a little bit far away from you all here. I'm trying to look over. In fact, I can't even see the screen. So if you have questions, I'll get to you. Just raise your hand or put a note in the chat box. I'd be more than glad to get back to you. And I will swivel the camera back this way. This is a little hard to see, I know. You know, I tried to zoom this in as best I could. And we've only got one camera. It's a fixed mount. It does swivel, but it's a fixed location. So it's not like we're, you know, a Hollywood set or whatever. We can move the camera around and whatnot, and the lighting is what the lighting is, so we have to kind of deal with what we've got. So just to pick up where we left off last time, the last thing we talked about was equilibrium, and that is we put demand and supply together in the same graph in some market model for some good, whatever the good in question is. We said the demand tends to be a downward sloping curve, supply upward sloping, so they have opposite slopes, which means what? It means they have different reactions to price. That is, buyers want lower prices, sellers want higher prices. That's why they tend to demand and supply greater quantities at different prices depending upon their point of view, which is not particularly shocking information. So the thing about it is, we talk about equilibrium. What we're talking about is a condition of relative balance in a market. Basically, the definition is a relative balance in a market. Short term, because just like the diagram that I drew of demand and of supply, where I said we can take a picture of it because it's going to change, well, so will equilibrium itself. And equilibrium really has two characters. It's price and it's quantity. So we call it the P with a little asterisk, P star, that's how we pronounce it. Q, equilibrium quantity, is Q star, we pronounce that Q star. It's an equilibrium quantity. And when we talk about what the equilibrium quantity is, we're saying this is a condition in which the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. And so in other words, it's the only condition in which the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. In other words, what we're saying here is there are no shortages and no surpluses. No shortages and no surpluses. And a shortage would simply be a case in which you have the quantity demanded out here and the quantity supplied out here. And so what do you end up with here? You have a quantity demanded there. At that particular price, however, the quantity supplied is here. So you've got quantity demanded exceeding the quantity supplied. And so what you end up with here is you have a shortage. You have a shortage. So at that particular price level, that the demand side would demand, supply side's unwilling to provide as much. And so that difference here is what we would call a shortage. And we're going to come back to shortages and surpluses a bit later when we talk more about price controls, that is price floors and price ceilings. So I would not worry about, you may have already read it, that's fine. It's not anything that you won't need to use again, but you don't have to worry about it right now. It's not going to be an issue. So shortage is simply a case in which what? Quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied. In other words, it's an out of equilibrium condition. It's an out of equilibrium condition, and there's no price that works that will solve that particular shortage. How the shortage is cleared is basically the supply side has to dial up their quantity of supply in order to meet that shortage, because one rule of thumb is if your goods, whatever you're selling, even if it's a service, are flying off the shelves, then you need to produce more, and you should probably raise your prices in doing it. And that's a pretty good rule of thumb pretty much everywhere in business. And in order to reach this price called the equilibrium price, which we call a market clearing price, it's a market clearing price. And the reason it's a market clearing price is it is the price associated with the quantity of equilibrium, the equilibrium quantity. It's the only price at which quantity demand will equal quantity supply, because there is no price at which the shortage is solved. And we know, just in our own experience of shortages, if you think back to the beginning of the pandemic when things like Clorox bleach and paper towels and all that were in a shortage, and you had some people going to Walmart and Costco, hoarding them, buying massive quantities, then putting them on eBay and selling for massive prices. Well, that's the response of the supply side. In this case, ordinary buyers became suppliers and raised the price in order to clear the shortage. For those who really, really, really wanted to buy those goods at elevated prices, they did so. And you see this happening, this sort of out of equilibrium condition, when markets get knocked out of equilibrium. And just like everywhere where equilibrium is a state of balance, getting knocked out of equilibrium is a condition that has to be repaired somehow, okay? So that's an example of I'm going to go and erase this, of a shortage, an out of equilibrium condition. What about an opposite condition? And that is a condition in which it's the opposite situation. So, and let me go ahead and sort of adjust some of this here. I'll just sort of come back to to where we were a second ago. Let me grab one of my markers here. And I realize this is not an ideal setup, this board. I'm not going to be here very long though, so kind of bear with me and kind of deal with what we've got here, if you would. So what about this? What about now if you have a condition in which you have one equilibrium price quantity, equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity. Now you've got a case in which the supply side is out here, the quantity supplied, but at that particular price level, the demand side doesn't want to demand that much. And so what have you got now? You've got a case of a surplus. And a surplus is simply a case in which quantity supplied exceeds quantity demanded. And what happens when you've got a surplus that is too much goods sitting around, not moving? If you're the seller, you should lower the price and dial down the production of whatever that good in question is, until you get back to an equilibrium condition where the quantity demanded will equal the quantity supplied, and you'll be back to a condition that will clear the market, a market clearing price, whenever there's a surplus. Now, one final thing I'll say about equilibrium before we move on to, so when I'm talking about these out of equilibrium conditions, is the idea that sometimes markets will get out of equilibrium for whatever reason, and then they'll get back at equilibrium, or rather than being out of equilibrium, they'll move to a new equilibrium. And that's really what I want to go on to next, is the idea of moving on to a new equilibrium. Before I do that, does anyone have any questions about what I just talked about there? And I'm going to try to do my best here to swivel the camera and see how that works. I have to adjust a little bit here. Let me zoom out a little bit. Okay, well, this is not exactly Hollywood, but hopefully that's a little bit, hopefully that's good. Hopefully you can tell what we're doing here. So let me see if I'm going to turn my monitor here so I can see myself. A little, oops. Whoa, is everybody there? Oh, okay, there we go. The thing just kind of winked out on me a minute. Okay, so anyway, we talked about out of equilibrium conditions, shortages and surpluses. That is, in cases in which the quantity demanded does not equal the quantity supplied. And so we've got an imbalance in the market. So if equilibrium is defined as a short-term state of relative balance in a market, then these out of equilibrium conditions are short-term conditions of relative imbalance in a market. And it's one thing to have a shortage or a surplus it's usually temporary, and sometimes it's caused by, as we'll see next week when we come back, we'll see that sometimes it's by government controls that keeps it out of equilibrium. And when the government steps in and does that, these can be a little bit more than temporary. They can be long-running shortages and surpluses. So we will talk a bit more about that. But let's talk about moving to new equilibrium conditions. And what I did was, the reason I started on the other board was just because I wanted to save some time so that we had the most time possible. to do the review for the exam, which is coming up on Wednesday. I want to talk about shifts in demand, which are the two top right graphs, or the two top graphs, and then two bottom graphs are shifts in supply. And what I'm doing is I'm simply shifting demand. So starting with some D1, and in this case, on the left-hand side, I've got a rightward shift that's an increase, right? Remember, right, left, as opposed to up, down. And then in this case, it's a leftward shift, which is a decrease. And we want to see what happens to equilibrium based upon that. And the same goes with supply, where I've got a rightward shift in supply and a leftward shift in supply. In other words, an increase and a decrease. And so I've already gone ahead and sort of drawn out for you the original equilibrium conditions. And so now, what about the new equilibrium condition? And this is going to be, remember that what can cause shifts to demand, and then later we'll see what can cause shifts to supply. It's those things that are non-price related. Price doesn't cause it, but price follows along. It does whatever the shifter is doing, whether it's demand or supply. And remember, we said that what can cause demand to shift would be one of those determinants of demand, non-price variables, things like changes in income, changes in wealth, changes in tastes and preferences, tax policy, and there's a whole long list that we went over in class, and we can talk more about it. So what happens when there's an increase? And there's nothing that goes on with supply. So in this case, what I'm doing, I know textbooks, this one being no exception, will oftentimes get into things like simultaneous shifts, where demand and supply both are changing. To me, that's, I don't know, it's a little bit busy, really, for what we're trying to do in an intro class. If you were really interested in what would happen with a rightward shift in demand and a simultaneous rightward shift in supply, you can simply draw it out if you like. It's not all that common where you see both of them shifting at the same time. I'm not saying it's unheard of, but it's not as common, and it doesn't really advance what we're trying to do here, which is really to describe new equilibrium conditions. And so if we start with some D1, that's some initial condition of demand, take a picture of it because it's going to change. Supply, we're going to say remains unchanged. What happens if there's a rightward shift? Maybe because of an increase in buyers or an increase in income or whatever. Well, what will happen is, if there's an increase in demand, we would expect there's an increase in the quantity demanded. So as a result, the quantity, which is really the quantity exchanged, will increase as a result of that increase in demand. And by the way, if supply hasn't changed, supply hasn't had a chance to really respond to this yet, the price should go up, right? Because remember, if the price is rising, what do suppliers do? They provide more output and they charge the higher price. In other words, in this particular case, demand is rising. And so we say that the demand side is bidding up the price of the good, whatever the good in question is, it's being bid up. And so that particular price is going to change, as is the particular quantity demanded. And so as a result, we move to a new equilibrium condition. And it's appropriate to keep the same asterisks here, because it's not out of equilibrium, it's a new equilibrium. It's a new equilibrium condition. Whatever is changing, maybe there's a tax cut, maybe there's a stimulus, right? I mean, one of the explanations, and I know this is a micro course, but one of the explanations for why we're suddenly seeing inflation, or maybe I shouldn't say suddenly, it's been with us now for a while, is the fact that there's been so much stimulus to the economy, including to households, that people are demanding more and more goods, and those prices are simply going up. Suppliers are taking advantage of that by raising prices. So that would be one explanation, not the only one, because there are some supply elements to it as well, but it's one idea of what's going on. Okay, so that's a change in demand, increase in demand with no change in supply. What about a decrease in supply, in demand with no change in supply? We've got a decrease in demand because of maybe reduced incomes, maybe higher taxes, whatever. Well, what would you expect to see happen? Well, if there's a reduction in demand, then you probably are going to have, well, not probably, you are going to have a reduction in the quantity exchange, and so as a result, the quantity will go down. And if it does go down, it's probably going to be at a lower price, because of the fact that sellers are going to do what? If buyers are staying away, they're probably going to lower the price of their goods in order to move those goods. And it could be, whatever the reasons are that the demand side is leaving the market. It could be that the good in question, whatever this market is describing, is an obsolete good, or it's a good on its way out, right? Maybe it's an old generation smartphone, and as a result, maybe you can buy one and you probably aren't going to pay very much for it. I don't even know if you can buy used smartphones, but or used anything really. Used anything always goes at lower prices because it's obviously it's been depreciated. Nobody really wants it as much, so there's less demand, and so as a result, if you're the seller, you're going to sell it at a lower price. But it isn't just that. It isn't just that particular obsolescence or worn out issue. It's whatever the reason for buyers leaving the market are. That is, it could be a reduction in income, or it could even be that expectations piece where people don't feel very good about things, about maybe the future, and so as a result, they want to stay away from buying certain goods. And in uncertain economic times, when people stay away from buying new cars, for instance, you see lots and lots of discounts on new cars, lots of deals, lots of special financing, even while people are buying less because sellers want to get rid of the product. At the same time, the manufacturers of those products are dialing down their production in anticipation of that. Okay, so both of those are shifts in demand with no change in supply and new equilibrium conditions that result from those shifts. Okay, so questions about either of those, and if I can answer it, excuse me, either of those, I'll be happy to. We're doing great on time, so I'm not, hopefully I'm not going too quickly, and if I am, feel free to stop me. And I'll probably just try to take this as long as I can today until we're out of time with the class, and then for those of you watching on the video, you can obviously look at that review session again and again, or anything again for that matter. So those are shifts in demand. What about shifts in supply, where we've started with some equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity, with some S1, some starting point, and there's an increase in supply for whatever reason. More suppliers are entering the market. It could be there's a tax cut, so now suppliers are more able to provide more output because the price of doing business goes down. And remember, when we talked about shifts in supply, we're talking about those non-price related things. Price will change, but not because price changes, but because supply in this case changes, just like in the case of demand shifts. Okay, price is not the issue, price just sort of follows along. But cost of production, and we talked about this a bit before, cost of production might go down. And one of the things that I said last week was, of all these determinants of supply, this list of the DNA of supply, what was the main one that we talked about was changes in the cost of production. And we're going to be coming back again and again to that because it really is critical to an understanding of the economics of suppliers. And that's a lot of what we do in introductory micro, because really a lot of the reason for this course, not solely because anybody can take this course, but it's oftentimes a prerequisite for business schools who really emphasize this idea of cost and the connection between cost and price. So let's say it's a cost of change of cost of production, costs are going down for whatever reason. So as a result, suppliers are going to provide more. And because there are more suppliers providing goods, they're now competing over what is a fixed amount of demand. And so as a result, they're going to bring the price of this good down. And so there's going to be more quantity because of more supply in the market, but it's going to come at a lower price. And so as a result, the price comes down. And think about this, think about whatever the good in question is, where new sellers have entered the market, and as a result, the price comes down for that particular good. And think about something like internet service, even when internet service first came out, where it was relatively expensive, or cell phone service is probably even better, where there were only a limited number of cell phone providers in every market. And when cell phones first came out, the cost was very expensive. I remember paying hundreds of dollars a month sometimes in order to have a cell phone. And today, yeah, you can still pay that much, but you're probably going to have lots and lots and lots of features and unlimited, sorts of items. Whereas before you were limited, and you didn't have very many features, and that's because there was not much competition. As competition has increased in that business, the prices come down to make it pretty affordable, to the point where pretty much everybody's got a cell phone. And so that's not everyone. I mean, if you don't want one, you probably don't want one, but that's an example of that particular thing. Now there are lots and lots of providers for that particular good. And I would suspect too that the cost of production is one reason why there's a lot more providers. Okay? And so one thing feeds on another, and then demand will probably grow over time. But then that gets us into the simultaneous shift, which is not what I'm trying to do here. I'm just trying to describe one shift in the market and one change in equilibrium. So lower prices with higher quantity. Okay. All right. So that would be a rightward shift, an increase in overall supply. And again, I know I keep going back to this again and again. I know you're tired of hearing me say it, but when we talk about increases, think about right versus an increase, because look, if you keep raising the supply, it's going to look like it's going down, when in fact it's actually going up. It's the price that's coming down. That's because of the slope of the supply curve. So again, think of the number line, orient yourself to the origin. A rightward shift is an increase, a leftward shift is a decrease. Okay, so let's talk about the final scenario here. That's the leftward shift in supply. That is some change in supply to the left, a decrease in supply for whatever reason, and so what happens? Well, suppliers are providing less output for whatever particular reason. Let's say it's an increase in taxes, for instance. An increase in taxes, and so firms find less profitable to be in a particular business. Some will leave altogether, which means there's less competition. Less competition means there's going to be a higher price for this. And so as a result, the only buyers who are left paying for it are those who are willing to pay the higher price, but they're going to demand less quantity because of that higher price. And it's not the price that has done it. The price is as a result of a leftward shift, maybe because of an increase in income taxes, or an increase in regulation, or an increase in the overall cost of production. Remember, we heard over and over again, if watching the local news now for the last several years, that hey, if you raise the minimum wage, we're not going to be able to keep our doors open, all that kind of thing, right? And I think, to my knowledge, only one restaurant has actually closed because of the increase in the minimum wage. It was a restaurant in Santa Fe, and who knows why they ended up closing. And there probably are others as well, but with the increase in the minimum wage. But restaurants are a bad example because a lot of their staff are paid by tips, not by minimum wage in the first place. And so that was probably not the best reporting on that. You might look at other places which workers do not receive tips to see what is the effect on employment, given an increase in the cost of doing business, which therefore shifts the supply curve. And no doubt it probably would in some cases shift the supply curve to the left, or some firms may not want to do business in Santa Fe County because they don't like the minimum wage in Santa Fe County. Maybe they like it in Valencia County and Bernalillo County, etc. Okay. All right. So questions about any of these shifts in demand, shifts in supply. I went ahead and sort of drew these out just in the interest of time so that we could move ahead here. I didn't want to take us too deeply into chapter 3 beyond what was going to be covered in the exam. So I'm going to go ahead and erase this because I've got one more topic to talk about, and then we'll spend the rest of the time talking about the exam, what to expect, what's going to be covered, and it's also your time as well. You know, I don't know whether or not I've said this before. I think I may have, but feel free to pipe up and ask questions. Usually the live feed, we have a lot fewer people who catch it later, and that's fine. It's not a problem. I mean, I'm not sitting here saying that I expect everybody to watch it live. It doesn't, and it's not the point. There's a reason why we're doing this as a recorded session. But one advantage, though, if you do pick up a live feed, is you can catch me in real time and say, "Hey, whoa, stop!" And feel free to do that. I'm not. You don't have to. Preface your question to say, "Hey, I need to, ask what's going on here." So that's feel free to do that. Okay. Okay, so one final topic, and it concerns equilibrium, and it also concerns what equilibrium means to buyers, what equilibrium means to sellers, and this is really going to be the last bit that I talk about before we move on to to talking about the exam, and that is, what about this condition in which you have? Let's just take demand first of all. Okay, let's draw a demand curve, and again, remember these axes are these rays going infinitely. We got a dollar figure on the vertical axis, which is price. A number, which is quantity, and you've got some downward sloping demand curve, right? All right, so you've got a downward sloping demand curve, and let's say you've got some equilibrium price, whatever that price is. Let's say it's let's say the good in question is a 2-liter or a 12-pack of Diet Coke, okay? And let's say the equilibrium price is $4, okay? Maybe a little low, I don't know, but and let's say that you as a seller, you set off, on your honey-do list was to go buy a 12-pack of Diet Coke, and so you expect you're going to pay $5, and so in other words, you think you're going to pay $5. And maybe there's somebody next to you, maybe comes from a different state, and maybe is willing to pay $6, all the way up. And so when you go to Walmart or wherever you go, you see it's only $4. what do? Well, you buy it at $4. In fact, maybe you buy more quantities of it at $4 per unit because you thought you expect it and you're perfectly willing and able to pay a higher price for it. But you don't have to, because the equilibrium price is what the equilibrium price is. You don't go up to the cash register and say, you know what, I really expect to pay $5 for this 12-pack of Diet Coke. By all rights, I owe you $5. It's only fair that I pay you this. No, you don't, obviously not, right? That sounds like a bit of lunacy, and so you wouldn't do it. Now, at the same time, I will say this: if you walked in expecting to pay $2 and the price is $4, and you say, okay, I'm going to haggle over the price of this, we don't really have a culture in America where you can do a lot of that. There are really only two goods that you can, as an ordinary consumer, can haggle over the price, and that's houses and cars. There's a lot of economic evidence that suggests that people are not very good at it, not because there's anything inherently wrong with us as American consumers, because we don't really have much muscle memory for doing that. There are cultures in the world, however, where people do haggle over everything. I'll buy this grapefruit, 50 cents. You got to be crazy. I'll give you 30 cents. That's it's this back and forth sort of thing. There are lots of cultures in the world where we can do that. Here, we don't really have that very much. So if you expect to pay $2, it's not probably going to happen. Probably. I'm not saying it never happens where somebody says, okay, I'll take your $2 sold, you're done, right? Instead, it's going to be $4 at a minimum. But here's the thing, this is what we're really getting at, is that there are buyers out there. Now they're shrinking in terms of number, right? Because we're going in this direction as the price goes up, right? They're getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, but there are people willing to pay a higher price for that particular good. And let's say the good in question is not something novel like Diet Coke, but let's say it's Super Bowl tickets, and the price of the Super Bowl ticket is, let's say, $400 for the top row seats or whatever. I really have no idea what Super Bowl tickets cost. It may be low, it may be high. I have no idea. I'm sure it's expensive, right? But I would imagine there are definitely people out there willing to pay $2,000, $3,000, $10,000 a ticket. They're certainly out there, but wouldn't have to if they're lucky enough to get that at $400. And so for all those buyers who are willing and able to pay a price greater than the equilibrium price, they have earned what we call consumer surplus. Consumer surplus. The consumer surplus is basically defined as this: it's the value accruing to buyers. It's the value accruing to buyers who are willing and able to pay a price greater than equilibrium price. And again, because demand is this idea of willingness and ability, willing and able to pay a price greater than the equilibrium price. In other words, the market clearing price. So if you want to go pay $5, $6, $7 for Diet Coke, I'm not even sure they would take your money if you wanted to pay $7 for a 12-pack of Diet Coke that's priced at $4. But keep in mind too, but I'm sure there's somebody willing to take your money if you're willing to pay $700 or $1,700 for a Super Bowl ticket. That is why we've got all these sites and all these sellers who look to scoop up tickets and resell them at higher prices. And in fact, there's a substantial amount of economic literature in microeconomics which talks about ticket scalping and why it exists. It's because the price of the good is not priced right. And that's why you have the entire market of ticket scalping, which in some places I think is illegal. I don't think it's illegal in Albuquerque. I don't know for sure. But I had a friend of mine, a good friend of mine I went to high school with, who, when we went to college, his brother already started a business of buying up basketball and football tickets at the university where we lived and then reselling them to people. They made a good living, made a really good living doing that. That's what he did for a living while attending college, to the point where when he graduated, he used his college degree to become a ticket scalper, which, in terms of scalping sounds like they're up to no good, but it's, maybe that's a bad word, an unfortunate word, but it's in a lot of places today, it's perfectly legal and legit. The fact that there are websites like StubHub, and whatnot are testament to that. So we should probably, be clear about what's going on. So consumer surplus, the value accruing to buyers, willing and able to pay a price greater than the equilibrium price. All that is consumer surplus. So, all right, one final bit on consumer surplus, and I'll move on to producer surplus, and then I'll talk about the exam. Is okay, well, so what? Who cares, right? Okay, that's a fair question. And when we talk about so what and who cares, I think the important thing to know here is the fact that we're going to be talking about economic outcomes within markets a bit later in the course, particularly when we talk about monopolies, monopolies being defined as single sellers of goods in a market. We haven't even talked about the supply side here yet, with this particular scenario. But we're going to talk about cases in which maybe the consumer surplus shrinks and shrinks and shrinks because there's only one seller in a market. So as a result, the value to the supply side exceeds that of the value to the demand side, which is really what this consumer surplus is demand side value. And so as a result, we can say it's an inefficient condition for the market. And a lot of economic analysis, particularly that which affects regulation of price, particularly in the case of monopoly, concerns this idea of how do we know that consumers are being, disadvantaged? What's the effect on consumer surplus? And how do we know what the effect on consumer surplus is? Because we know what the demand function is, we know what the price is. So as a result, it's a somewhat easy to measure issue. And if the price is changing, then we can determine what the effect of consumer surplus is. So it does have, it's not just theoretical where I'm just out here drawing things on a chalkboard or a whiteboard. It's got real life application. Okay, well that's the demand side. What about the supply side? And what's going on there? So let's say we have a similar condition with just got a PQ plan, whatever the gooding question is. We've got an upward sloping supply curve looking something like that. And we've got an equilibrium price of a good. And it doesn't really matter what the gooding question is. Let's say it's loaves of bread, for instance, and a loaf of bread costs $3. Okay, so you're a baker and you're producing loaves of bread, and the price is $3. In other words, that's the equilibrium price, the market clearing price. The market determined price, the price at which buyers and sellers agree should be the market clearing price. But if you're the seller and you're able to take $1, you'll take $1. And if you're able to take $1, you're definitely willing to take $2. If you're willing to take $2, you're definitely willing to take $2.50. If you're able to accept that. Now, what we haven't talked about is the cost of production, which is something that doesn't even apply here, but it does apply here. And that is, maybe $1 is too low. It costs you $1.50 to make a loaf of bread. So maybe $1 is out, but $2 might not be. $2.50 is. But guess what? It doesn't really matter what you as the seller think should be the price. It's the market that determines the price. Which is not to say that every seller has got the identical price throughout the market. Most of us, I think, know that's not the case. In fact, if you're a savvy consumer, you probably look at the sale ads, Albertsons and Smiths and Lowe's as they come across every week in your mail. You're probably looking, I can get broccoli cheaper at Albertsons this week, and this week, but paper towels are cheaper at Smith's, and so that sort of thing. So, but they're not so much different that they deviate wildly from the equilibrium price. And to be fair, how many people actually do go around to buy one good here, one good there, one good there? I mean, if you've got all the time in the world, yeah, you might. That's really not the reality. In fact, what they're trying to do is to try to get you in the door because that one good really does pique your interest. Maybe you do really want to buy broccoli for that reduced price. And so for sellers who are willing to be able to take a price lower than the equilibrium price, this entire region is known as producer surplus. Producer surplus, the very same concept really, but it's the value accruing to sellers in this case, who are willing and able to sell at a price less than the equilibrium price. Okay, so again, one of the definitions of demand or of supply is the willingness and ability to do something. In other words, to sell products at various prices and quantities. So producer surplus, the value accruing to sellers, willing and able to sell at a price less than the equilibrium price. And it's the shaded area here. It's the shaded area here. And so when we talk about this shaded area, we're talking about an area that can be measurable. And we won't get into this just yet, but we'll probably come back to how we measure these and why it's important a bit later, particularly when we start talking about monopoly. I know your book tends to get a little bit more into the math of this than what I do in class, particularly early on, because I feel like it's a better idea for us to get some of the qualitative characteristics out of the way before we get into the quantitative. But nonetheless, these are our measurable areas. And in fact, if you've got something looking like this, where really it's in effect, it's a right triangle, right? I didn't probably draw it to because it's much like a right triangle, but it's a right triangle. And so when we talk about this area here, the area of any right triangle is simply defined as 1/2 base times height. And it doesn't really matter whether you call this height or this base. This would probably be height, this would be base. And if you know the distance between 0 and the price, and 0 and equilibrium quantity, then you've got the base and the height, and you've got 1/2, and that's the area. And what do you end up with? You have so it's going to be 1/2 of a, let's see, base is going to be a number, right? Times height, which is a dollar figure. And everywhere in economics, whenever you have a number, multiply it or divided by a dollar figure, you're going to end up with some dollar figure. Always, always, always. So we'll say the consumer or producer surplus is what? It's $5,000 or whatever. Okay. And that's the value for that, for the sellers in that market. We're willing and able to sell at a price less than the equilibrium price. Okay, so and the reason why it's 1/2 base, it's very simple. I mean, if you think of what a right triangle is, it's any kind of square or rectangle, you just simply chop in half. And we know that width times length is the area of a rectangle. Well, it's just 1/2 of that is all we're really doing. We're just simply multiplying it by half in order to get the area. That's all. So it's a right triangle in both cases. Okay. If we do it as a right triangle, if you have a straight line, and if you have a curvy figure that becomes your hypotenuse, then you have to use calculus, and that's not what we're going to do here. Okay, but we'll come back to that a bit later. There will not be a question on the exam dealing with the computation of producer and consumer surplus. Okay. All right. So, are there questions for me? Taking a look here to see whether or not there are any questions. I don't see any yet. I'm going to go ahead and erase this just so I can start to talk about the exam. So I've talked about this intermittently. So this week is week 4. It's our first exam week. And what I've said in the class before is that to me it's a more important imperative to try to stick with the schedule for exams than it is to try to run like crazy and to try to shoehorn all the material that I thought we would get to for an exam into that particular exam. And so, when I was designing the course, I thought, well, maybe we'll get into chapter 4 for this exam. And we did not. In fact, we left off just a bit of chapter 3, which I'll pick up next week, week 5, when we come back on Monday. Okay. And that deals with price controls. But we'll come back to that. So don't worry about price floors and price ceilings. That will not be part of the exam. The consumer and producer surplus will be. So what about this exam? Again, I said before, you have 3 different options by which to take it. You can come to class on Wednesday, 1:30 to 2:45, and you can take a paper copy of the exam. You can use your text, which is online, so you'll want to bring a computer, like a laptop. You can use your notes. You can use whatever it is you want to use if you want to do that, or you can go to one of the testing centers at Maine or Westside or wherever, and I'll have the paper exam sent there. I don't suspect that'll be that popular of an option. I think the third option is probably where most people want to be, and that's taking it online. It'll be available in Brightspace. I was putting it together over the weekend. I'm not quite done yet, but I know what's going to go into it, so I can pretty much tell you what to expect for the exam. And so just to tell you what you're going to be looking at here is this. So if you do take it online in Brightspace, you'll have 90 minutes available, okay, for the exam. So exam 1, and there'll be a clock running, and you'll want to take this in one session. So it'll be available right after class on Wednesday. So what are we going to do on Wednesday then? Well, it's going to be a session that's going to be for you. If you show up to class on Wednesday, then that's, what is that, 2/2, right? Oops, 2/2, right? February 2nd. Groundhog Day, right? February 2nd. And it's going to be available right after class, right? And I'll just, before I leave here, I'm just going to click to make it available. It's going to be a Brightspace. And it's going to be available 2/2 through the end of the day on the Sunday the 6th. That's 11:59 p.m. And it will no longer become available. You'll have 90 minutes to do it. And you'll want to take it in one sitting, because I do not think, and sometimes I'm surprised by what people tell me Brightspace does, but I don't think you can stop and come back and go back into it. If you can, I hope you let me know so that I can tell people that, but I don't think you can. So when you take the exam, whenever you take it, and I don't think I would wait till, 11 p.m. on Sunday, because that doesn't leave you much time, because you only got 90 minutes, and invariably somebody's going to wait till 11 o'clock on Sunday night. I just know how these things work. But I would give yourself some time, and if you want to do it on Sunday, that's fine. You have more time to do it, but maybe, get a nice quiet place and a cup of coffee or whatever, and take your time doing it. So it's going to be multiple choice only. So it's going to be 40 multiple choice questions. And if you take it in class, you'll have, even though the class runs 75 minutes, I don't believe there's a class that comes right immediately afterward, but we do need to clear out because there is another class coming later. So there are 40 multiple choice questions. Oops. And they come, it's my handwriting today. So, and they come from chapters 1, 2, and 3. 1, 2, and 3, and 1, 2, and 3, and the material in class. So in class or in video sorts of material. And this is important as well because it's not just going to be questions from the exam, it's from the textbook itself. About maybe 3/4 of the questions will come from the test bank, which was created for that OpenStax book itself, okay? And about the other quarter or so are my own, because of the fact that the textbook doesn't have some things in it like positive, well, I think it does have things like normal goods and inferior goods. It definitely doesn't have discussion of the factors of production, I don't believe. So there are some things that are not talked about there that we will have covered on the exam. And again, since you're doing it on your own, you'll be able to use whatever resources are available to you. So feel free to do that. So what are we talking about here in terms of the exam? And I've got some notes here. I'm going to be sort of hovering in and out of the camera here, and I apologize for that. It's just that I've got this on my computer here, and I don't want to lose power, and my cord doesn't stretch this far for whatever reason. So let's talk about what some of the questions are. What some of the things you want to know for the exam? There's a couple questions dealing with types of economies, command economies versus free market economies. We didn't talk a heck of a lot about it, but it's a fairly simple to understand concept, and that is command economies are those that are heavily driven by government, where government makes the big decisions. And there aren't as many command economies in the world today as what there used to be. The old Soviet Union and the old People's Republic of China being two of the ones that were most prominent. Today, those are mostly free market economies. But the idea of the governments making decisions were important. And so you want to read that part of the text. It's in chapter 1, dealing with command versus free market economies. Free market economies, the decisions are made primarily by private actors. It doesn't mean that there are no government entities which are involved, because there are, and we'll see government having a role to play within the economy. But for the most part, we're talking about government-run economies. We talk about command economies and free market economies. We're talking about economies where private actors make the majority of the decisions. Okay, so Cuba would be an example of that. That'd be a great example of a command economy. Okay, there are a couple of questions dealing with, well, at least one question, dealing with the difference between micro and macro. And we talked about this really day 1 of class back on January 10th. What are the differences between micro and macro? There's also discussion in your text about micro versus macro. We said micro was sort of the small picture view of economics, or street level view economics. Walking along the street, you see individual firms selling individual goods at individual prices. In other words, it's the study of markets and industries, that sort of thing. Whereas macro is a big picture view of entire economies, including the global economy, and you're dealing with other variables like unemployment, interest rates, things like that. These are not topics that we tend to cover. Those latter two topics are not ones that we tend to cover in microeconomics, which are basically the study of markets. Okay, and also one of the things that we talked about when I talked in class about some of the subsets of microeconomics, we said that one of these was labor economics. And that was going to be the main thrust of chapter 4, even though chapter 4 in your book talks also about financial markets. I'm not going to really cover that. I don't know that I would have put those two things together in the same chapter, but I didn't write the book. It's a free textbook, so I think it's a good textbook, but it is kind of what it is. And so I guess that's the trade-off. And so we're not going to be covering the finance piece. We will get to the labor piece after we come back from this exam on Wednesday. It'll be next week, and we'll be getting into that next Monday, a week from today. So labor is a piece of that, wage determination, supply of labor, demand of labor. That would be an example. Also things like industrial organization, which is what we're going to be talking about a bit later in the class too. That is how industries themselves are organized, are examples of microeconomics. Okay, let me see here. There are a couple of questions dealing with the circular flow model. So the circular flow model, you might remember, is, and I told you in class that there are probably millions of different examples of circular flow models. In class, we had like 3 boxes of households, government, business firms, exchanging value. And so you just want to know who the actors are, okay? So you've got households, government, and business firms. And what they do. So households basically do what? Sell labor to firms in exchange for money flow wages, right? Whereas firms provide goods to households and other firms, but primarily to households. The vast majority of goods that are produced are bought by households. And then they, in exchange for spending by households. That's circular flow going on. Okay. And then, so you want to know who these actors are and what they're doing, how they're exchanging value. You've got a physical flow and a financial flow that are important to know about. The financial flow basically being the money flow of wages being paid to households. Households turn those wages into spending. Okay. Also, there's a question about sectors of the economy. I don't believe, I can't recall offhand in chapter 1 whether or not this was discussed, but it's the idea of, if you take households and firms together, they constitute what we call the private sector. That is, what's the characteristic of the private sector that we should talk about? It's the idea that decisions tend to be made privately and in those actors' own self-interest, as opposed to government, which government and all its entities would be called the public sector, where decisions tend to be made more publicly, not always, but more publicly, but generally always for the public interest rather than for the private interest of any governmental actor, at least in a democratic state that works reasonably efficiently. Okay, so you want to know about who the actors are and that sector orientation, public versus private sector. Okay, all right, let me see here. So I'm just kind of flipping down my list. I guess I could probably swivel the camera so you can see me, because I hate to be rude here. Let's see here. Okay, I guess you can see me. I don't know that you really want to see me, but anyway, here I am. So I don't have a plug-in over here, and I don't want my laptop to run out of power. And I didn't want to interfere with my Zoom link here, so I have my laptop plugged in separately. So, and I've got the exam mostly read, so I'm just kind of flipping through, I'm kind of sliding through here to give you an idea of what to look like, what to look for. Also, there's a question dealing with economic models. Okay, so we talked earlier about week 2 or so about this idea of economic models and what they're all about. That is the idea that you've got, it's a different way of, it's a way of looking at economic phenomena by way of drawing a picture, in other words. So what is a model? It's a representation, it's a simulation, it's a graphic illustration of something going on in economics. And so the circular flow model is an example. The production possibilities flow model is an example of a model. Even demand and supply are models, and that is, they're simply meant to illustrate reality. Okay, so you want to know what are the basic ones we talked about would truly constitute a model. That is circular flow, production possibilities, demand and supply. And that's by no means the end of the list of models we'll be talking about. But again, it's just a way of illustrating reality to get us out of just simply looking at things like the math of things, or the just by describing it. Okay. All right. Well, this is kind of good too, because I can actually see you a little better on this side of the room here. All right. So you want to know also about the difference between positive economic statements and normative economic statements. There are a couple of questions dealing with those. Remember, positive economic statements are statements of what is. That is, if I say that unemployment in New Mexico is at 5.8%, that's a statement of, it's an objective, measurable fact. You may disagree with how we arrived at the number, but most people would agree that's what unemployment is in New Mexico. And of the labor, of course, 5.8% are not working. Okay. Yeah, you could now, a normative economic statement would be unemployment should be lower, right? Unemployment should be 4%. That's a value judgment. Some would say maybe 5.8% is good enough. It's as good as it gets, maybe 5%. If we got to 5%, we'd be happy. 4% is not realistic. Again, those are all the normative statements are statements that usually involve the word should, and it's subjective. And it's subjective, and because it's subjective, it can become controversial because different people can disagree over what should be the outcome. And I can't think of anything that was more controversial, at least in probably my lifetime, from an economic debate standpoint, over the Affordable Care Act that was enacted in, I think, 2010, where the government said, well, the President Obama had made the point that all Americans should have health insurance. And not everyone agreed with that. And there was lots and lots of debate over that. Now, eventually, the law was passed that required all Americans to have health insurance. It was subsequently, and that's still the law of the land, although the penalties for that have been basically removed. So if something's illegal and there's no penalty for it, you can sort of follow along with that. But the point is, though, that a should statement forms policy. So President Obama believed that all Americans should have health insurance. And he was not alone. I mean, it wasn't, in fact, it wasn't even his sole idea. It's been around for a long time. He was just the executive in charge who pushed it through. And so others said Americans should not be required to have health insurance. So again, there's no right answer with a normative statement. It is what you believe it to be the case. That's right, subjective as opposed to objective. Okay, so you want to know the difference in this distinction between those two, because they really are a difference in terms of what these trade-offs are. Okay, and then speaking of trade-offs, there are a couple of questions dealing with the production possibilities model, and that's the idea that we presented it as like good A versus good B. That if I produce more of good A, I've got to give up some of the production of good B, or vice versa. If I want to produce more of good B, I've got to give up some of good A. In other words, there's a trade-off that exists. And trade-offs are these things, what you have to give up in order to get. Everywhere in economics, there are trade-offs involved, what you have to give up in order to get. If you want to get a college degree, you've got to give up some time in order to do it, maybe some money in order to do it. But the trade-off is that if you give that up, you are expected to have a higher lifetime earnings. And this is not me trying to sell college. Hopefully you're already sold because that's why you're here, but it does require a commitment. And as a result, that commitment is known as the trade-off. Also, if you put a value on that trade-off, that trade-off, the value of the trade-off, the value of the foregone opportunity, whether it's working extra hours or whatever, is what we call an opportunity cost. An opportunity cost is simply the value of a foregone alternative. And when we're being very specific about a particular question, it's usually the value of the best alternative that's foregone in order to do something. So if you want to go to, and I think the example we talked about in class was sort of an extreme example, but it would be somebody who gives up going to college because they can become a pro golfer like Tiger Woods, right? If you've got the opportunity to make several $1 million per year or go to college, maybe it would be a good idea to earn the several $1 million a year, then return to college later, that sort of thing. So nobody's saying that that's not a rational response. It no doubt is. So opportunity cost is the value of a foregone alternative. That also ties into a discussion of costs that we had, which I had said to the class, we're going to be expanding a bit further in the class. And that's the idea between explicit and implicit costs. When we talked about explicit costs, we're talking about what we would refer to as accounting costs. Again, pretty objective. Most people are going to agree. I think the example I gave was payroll expense. Most people are going to agree this is payroll expense for the week ending March 3rd or whatever. And so that's an explicit cost. An implicit cost, however, there's really an opportunity cost, which could be more subjective. And I was like, what is the value of that foregone alternative? What do I give up in order to do one thing without the other? Okay. Maybe what is the opportunity cost of having 15 workers as opposed to having only 10 workers, right? I could save that money and do something else, perhaps. But opportunity cost is the value of a foregone alternative. We also call it an implicit cost, and we're going to be returning to that again a bit later. So know about trade-offs, know about that. Also know about the production possibilities model. There are a number of questions dealing with the production possibilities curve. And I guess I'm over here now. So let me, so when we talk about production possibilities, remember, we talked about this idea of the production of good A or good B. Doesn't matter how you label these axes here, but one of the things we said was that if you're producing somewhere on the curve itself, you're at an efficient point of production. So that would be an efficient point, but this will be inefficient right here. Operating somewhere inside the curve is inefficient because you're not utilizing whatever inputs in order to maximize the outputs. A and B are outputs, in other words. And so whatever the inputs are, which are not reflected here, we just know that they're not being utilized fully because you're operating in an inefficient point. And all these points along the curve, what's known as productive efficiency. Productive efficiency. That is utilizing the inputs that are available to be the most productive at producing output. And then productive efficiency then differs from allocative efficiency. So know what that difference is. Allocative efficiency is simply producing goods that society most wants. And so if good A and good B, the only things that are being produced are Doritos and Fritos, right? Well, that's probably not a very balanced creation of food, right? So maybe that's not what society most wants, is only Doritos and Fritos or Snickers and M&Ms, right? Whatever the case might be, right? So some sort of balance between those. And I know we get a little bit absurd with some of the examples, but it's really the idea that allocative efficiency refers to, are we producing the right things for society? And we made the case that free markets tend to be pretty efficient at doing that because private actors have the incentive to produce the right goods. Whereas in a command economy, there may be no incentive to produce the right goods, which means you have all kinds of delays, bottlenecks, shortages, which run like crazy, and waiting lists, all those kinds of things. Okay? All right, so questions so far? You also want to know about scarcity in general, what we talked about with regard to scarcity. We gave a generic definition that is society's unlimited wants versus the scarce resources that we have in order to address those wants. That's basically the generic definition of what scarcity is. And we said that scarcity was really the sort of the reason being for why we have economics in the first place is because the things are scarce. Notably, resources are scarce, including time, by the way. Okay, which I don't think we've really talked about, but that would be an example of one. Oh, and speaking of time, there is a question about dealing with. There's one or two different scenarios dealing with. I've got the choice of studying or going to the movies, right? And then the question is, what do I give up to go to the movies? Will I give up the chance to study and the chance to do better on an exam the next day? Otherwise, what do I give up if I study? I give up the chance to go to the movies. So you want to know that in order to do one thing, you've got to give up something of the other. And we kind of talked about that, alluded to that just a minute ago with discussion about going to college or playing pro sports, that sort of thing. Same idea, you give up one thing in order to do another thing. And we're going to say that pretty much everywhere in economics, decisions tend to revolve around this idea of decision-making, choosing one thing instead of the other, meaning there's a trade-off that exists. And it's often very subjective because maybe you don't have the ability to go play pro golf or whatever, pro baseball. So it's going to matter to you, maybe to no one else. Okay. Let's see here. I'm just kind of scrolling through and seeing what we've got. Positive and normative statements I talked about. Kind of bear with me here a little bit. Okay. Other questions for me while I'm sort of scanning this a little bit here? Okay. All right. So okay. So let me do this. Oh, hold on a second. I just erased something here. I didn't want to erase. Let's see. Okay. Hold on a second. Bear with me. I just closed a file. I didn't want to close. Give me a second here. Well, shoot. Okay, here we go. All right. I don't know why I had trouble getting that I closed my file, I couldn't get it to reopen. Okay, we talked about, there are quite a lot of questions dealing with chapter 3. It's probably the most important chapter of this entire exam. Demand and supply, what demand looks like, what the law of demand is, the law of demand, which expresses the inverse relationship between price and quantity. So know what the law of demand is. Know that demand is a downward sloping function. The mnemonic device, if you like mnemonic devices, is if you're wondering whether demand is downward sloping or if it's upward sloping, think of D, demand down, right? Or supply being upward sloping, supply to the sky. That's another, if you like mnemonic devices, that might help you. Know about the law of supply and why the supply curve is upwardly sloping because of the direct relationship between price and quantity supply. Okay, and then know what those determinants, there are a number of questions dealing with what the determinants of demand are and the determinants of supply. And that is what can cause shifts. That is changes in the entire equation that would move demand or move supply. And there are non-price variables such as in the case of demand, changes in income, changes in tastes and preferences, changes in wealth, that sort of thing, changes in the prices of other goods like complements and substitutes. In the case of supply, it would be changes in the cost of production. That's really one of the key elements there. Also things like business forecasts, outlook, tax policy, those kinds of things. Okay, and then know the difference between those shifts, the difference between the shifts and the movement along either of those curves, which are due to only changes in price. So sliding up and down along these curves are only due to a change in price, whereas the movement of the entire curve is due to some non-price issue, which we call either the determinants of demand in the case of demand or determinants of supply in the case of supply. Okay, and then so know about those relationships and know what happens to if the price of a good goes up, then it means the quantity demanded goes down. The price of a good goes down, the quantity demanded goes up. So know about those relationships. Also know about right versus left. That is moving away from the origin is a rightward shift or an increase in either one of those. To the left is a decrease in either one of those. Then know also what equilibrium is about. It's that condition of relative balance in a market as to price and quantity. And it's simply a condition of balance within a market. And then know there's a reason why I did those 4 quadrants of shifts. Know what happens, what you would expect to see a change to equilibrium price and quantity be with, say, a rightward shift in demand and no change in supply. What would it be? And look, if you feel like you just want to draw somewhere on a piece of paper, okay, what does that look like? And then you can just draw it out. Rightward shift in demand. It's a higher price and higher quantity. Believe me, professional economists do that kind of thing all the time. Draw it out to see what that thing will look like when you create the scenario. Okay. Okay. Let me see here a minute. And know that what the slopes are. So if it's a downward slope, it's a negative slope. Okay. And in other words, you're going to get a negative value on whatever the slope is. If it's upward sloping, no, that's got a positive slope. And a negative slope always implies an inverse relationship between the variables on either axis, right? Whereas if it's a positive slope, it's going to have a direct relationship between the variables on both axes. Okay, so those slopes do matter, and they're going to matter a little bit more, particularly as we get into chapter 5, when we deal with differing slopes, particularly of demand, and we'll see how it's important for us to know about that. Okay. Okay. Also know about the difference between demand and quantity demanded, and supply and quantity supplied. The two are different. We talk about demand. We're talking about the entire demand function that we can click, take a picture of, and this is what demand looks like right now. It's all demand at various prices and quantities existing right now. Whereas quantity demanded would be every individual quantity demanded for every price that might exist at the moment based upon the current demand equation, whatever that is. And the same with supply and quantity supplied. Supply refers to the entire supply function. Quantity supplied, just the individual points of quantity associated with any individual price that might arise from that supply curve. Okay. Okay. Let me see here a minute. Let's see. Some of this I've already talked about. The market price or the equilibrium price is really the only price that clears the market. That's why we call a market clearing price. So that equilibrium price is the price associated with equilibrium quantity. It's the only price associated with equilibrium quantity. It is the price that clears the market. That is, there are no surpluses and there are no shortages. Okay. There are, let me see here, I think there probably are about 3 or 4 questions about shifts and what happens because of that. Some of those might be graphic, and so they'll show, say, a rightward or leftward shift to one of the functions, and you'll just want to be able to describe what's going on. And more importantly, maybe to describe what's, or to identify, these are all multiple choice, what might be happening. So if the supply curve is shifting left, then what might be one scenario that might explain why market supply is shifting left? It could be sellers are exiting the market. Sellers have gone bankrupt, and so as a result, there are fewer sellers. Or if demand is shifting right, maybe new buyers are entering the market, the population is increasing, people's incomes are rising, all those kinds of things might be explanations for why those functions might be shifting, or those curves might be shifting the way that they're shifting. Okay, and so there are a number of questions dealing with those kinds of things. Okay. And let me see here. So those are, and we went through a lot of this just here today, so it's probably not really necessary to go back into, but I'll answer any questions you've got specifically. I think that's just about, you want to know about substitutes and complements and what they are. There's discussion in your book about those, and if we talk about what can cause change in demand for a good, it may be a change in the price of a substitute or a complement. And remember, we define substitutes as goods which can be swapped for other goods in a purchase decision, often on the basis of price. So if 2 goods are close to one another, then one can choose one and not the other. And it doesn't have to be branded goods like Coke and Pepsi, or 2 different brands of salad dressing or soup or whatever. It could simply be 2 different kinds of goods altogether, like chicken and pork, or green beans and corn, right? All those could be substitutes. If the price of one is rising, maybe people demand less of that good and more of the other, okay? And then complements are goods which go together in a purchase decision because it makes sense that they go together. And so as a result, if you buy more of one, you're probably going to buy more of the other, or less of one also causes less of another because those goods are complementary, like hot dogs and hot dog buns were some of the examples, okay? Okay, so I've got about 6 minutes. I think I'm pretty close to having really talked about everything I wanted to talk about here. Okay, so there are a couple of questions dealing with factors of production. Your book really did not get into that discussion very much, if at all. I was trying to find it, and I don't know that I did find it. But we talked about it here because it really does come up again and again in economics. That is the idea of input factors, large categories of things which are sort of involved in the production process to create outputs to be exchanged in the market. So what are they? Land, labor, capital, entrepreneurial ability. And we said that those are really old, with the exception of entrepreneurial ability. We said that the terms land, labor, and capital are pretty old. They go back to the 18th century, and they don't really mean exactly what they were originally intended to mean. Land would refer to natural resources like minerals and timber and livestock, and capital refers to its original meaning, that is productive assets like equipment and machinery and more common or more modern usage like technology would be an example of that. So know about what those are, as well as labor and entrepreneurial ability, etc. And then there are a couple of questions dealing with consumer and producer surplus and what those are all about. So consumer surplus, I've actually still got some of that on the board here, is that which is the value which accrues to buyers who would pay a higher price or willing and able to pay a higher price, but because the market determines the price, would only have to pay whatever the price is that the market is requiring. So as a result, they pocket the difference. They find themselves to be happier and wealthier as a result of that. For all those different levels of prices that you find to be a happy coincidence that the price is less than you expected. In the case of producer surplus, it's those sellers who would sell at a price lower than the equilibrium price, the market price, but don't have to because the market price is what the market price is. And as a result, they will take the higher price, even though they would have been willing to have taken a lower price. Okay, and then we'll expand upon it. Those topics we just really got into the introductory bit of talking about consumer and producer surplus. We'll return to those again a bit later in the course. So I do want to emphasize that those are rather important topics that do come up again and again. They are measurable and that they do mean something. Okay. Also, you want to know that shifts to demand or shifts to supply would result in new equilibrium conditions, where out of equilibrium conditions are things like shortages and surpluses. Those are not equilibrium, those are out of equilibrium conditions. And so out of equilibrium conditions are considered to be only temporary, and they're usually due to something that has gone awry within a market, because markets don't always work efficiently. And we will come back to that idea a bit later, that the idea is that, yes, it looks like we're diagramming markets to be these nice and efficiently functioning machines, but sometimes they don't always work that well, and they need to be dealt with somehow, corrected. Okay. All right. So I think I've covered all the topics that I want to cover. And that's a lot, I know, but it's not. But some of these are ones that we really specifically covered in class, and that if you've been able to watch the videos and pay attention to what's going on there, you should be okay. I would urge everybody to, there are only 3 chapters, okay? In 4 weeks, that's pretty good. It can be a lot worse, and I know there are a lot of courses that go much faster in terms of reading. We tend not to pour on the reading very much in econ courses. The readings are important because they do give background and additional context, and all that. And also the videos are available for you to view as many times as you want. Those are for you to look at. And that's one of the beauties of the Attend Anywhere, is that you're not just limited to hearing me and then I'm going and you've got your notes to deal with, and that's it. So you've got those to view forever, as long as you want to. Okay. All right, so I've got about 2 minutes, looks like, and I'm happy to stay, answer any questions that you've got. Can I answer any questions for anybody? You can either put something in the chat box or speak up if you like. Okay, well, this is not your last chance. I'm available, today and tomorrow, and also if you choose to do it online. What I'm going to do on Wednesday, I'm going to just have an open Zoom link, which, if you want to just pop in at say 2 o'clock and say, hey, would you talk about consumer surplus? I'll be happy to do that. Okay. And then, that I'll close it obviously 2:45, which is when the class ends, but I'll have an open Zoom. It'll be like an office hour, or, hour and 15, right? So you can, ask me questions or clarify or whatever. And if you want to pop in for a minute, get your question answered, and pop off, pop away, that's fine too. Pop in, pop out, that's not a problem. So I'm available for you, and we are really trying to make the presentation of the course as accessible and as flexible as possible. That's why we're offering multiple modes of both course delivery as well as exam taking. Okay. All right. Well, again, if you do have questions, feel free to contact me between now and Wednesday, or at our regular class session on Wednesday. It will be up on Brightspace. It's almost done now. I just have to flip a switch, make it available. It'll be available right after class ends on Wednesday, and you'll have through Sunday night to do it. So you got some time to do it, but I would try to do it in one sitting when you're ready, and because I don't think you can go in and out. Now, I could be wrong about that, but I don't think so. I think that's the way. In fact, if you get cut off, because the reason I don't think so is because people are saying, hey, I got cut off, can you put me back in? And so they have to start over and whatnot. And that's not something you want to have happen. Okay. All right. Well, I will see you all Wednesday if you're here. Otherwise, I will see you in Brightspace. So good luck to everyone in the exam.